Friday morning. Chelmsford Prison, Essex. A man, an Ethiopian national, convicted of assaulting a 14-year-old girl, walks out through the gates. He's smiling. Free. The guards wave him off, paperwork in hand. But there's just one problem. He wasn't supposed to be released. Authorities would later call it an error. The public would call it a catastrophe. Because within hours, the entire country, from London to Leeds, was on edge. An escaped sex offender, a failed system, and a manhunt that would expose the cracks in Britain's immigration and justice systems. This is the story of Hadush Kebatu, a convicted criminal, an asylum-seeker, and the man who walked out of a British prison without anyone noticing until it was far too late. This is The Mistaken Release, the manhunt for Hadush Kebatu. When the news first broke, it sounded like something out of a movie. An asylum-seeker, convicted of sexually assaulting a child, released early by mistake. And within hours, Britain was boiling. Anger, fear, outrage. It spread through social media like wildfire. Who let him go? Why wasn't anyone watching? Is anyone safe anymore? By Sunday morning, the streets around London's Finsbury Park were crawling with armed officers. And just after 8:30 a.m., the manhunt came to an end. Hadush Kebatu, 32 years old, Ethiopian national, was finally caught. But the story doesn't end with his arrest. In fact, that's where it truly begins. Because behind this simple mistake lies a web of political failure, public mistrust, and the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask. How many more mistakes are waiting to happen? To understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to August. Epping, Essex, just outside London. A small market town, quiet, polite, the kind of place where people still greet each other in the morning. But in one corner of town stands the Bell Hotel, a modest, aging building that had, in recent years, become something else entirely. A government-run shelter for asylum seekers. It wasn't a secret. Locals knew. Some supported it. But others didn't. By summer, tensions were already running high. Protests had erupted outside the hotel, some peaceful, others violent, fueled by misinformation, political rhetoric, and anger about the UK's handling of asylum housing. And right in the middle of all that was a man named Hadush Kebatu. Kebatu arrived in the UK from Ethiopia, a country torn by internal conflict, ethnic violence, and famine. According to records, he entered the country seeking asylum, claiming he was fleeing persecution. 4 months, he lived quietly at the Bell Hotel. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to staff, and spent long hours pacing the hallway or standing outside alone, smoking. Some described him as distant. Others said he was oddly calm. But then, one night in late July, everything changed. A 14-year-old girl, who was visiting a relative staying at the hotel, was reportedly followed into a corridor by Kebatu. Police later said he cornered her, touched her inappropriately, and fled when she screamed for help. CCTV footage confirmed it. Within hours, he was arrested by Essex police. In September, the court sentenced him to 12 months in prison for sexual assault of a minor. He was transferred to HMP Chelmsford, a Category B prison known for overcrowding, staff shortages, and operational strain. And that's where the story should have ended. But as Britain would soon learn, sometimes, the system that's meant to protect us isn't just flawed, it's broken. By early October, the Bell Hotel was back in the headlines. Anti-immigration protests were intensifying, and the story of Kebatu's conviction had become ammunition for far-right groups online. On Telegram channels and Twitter, videos spread of angry demonstrators shouting, "Close the hotels! Protect our children!" The Bell Hotel became a symbol, not of sanctuary, but of outrage. And in the halls of government, ministers scrambled to manage the fallout. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, newly in office, was under pressure to prove he could handle immigration differently, to show he could be both humane and tough. But behind the scenes, the prison system was quietly unraveling. Staff shortages, outdated records, and a backlog of early release paperwork meant errors weren't just possible, they were inevitable. And one Friday morning, one of those errors walked right out the front gate. Friday, October 25th, 11:37 a.m. local time. A guard at HMP Chelmsford reviews a batch of release forms. Routine work. Names. Numbers. Prisoner IDs. Everything looks fine. He stamps the top of one file, cleared for release. That file belonged to Hadush Kebatu. Now, here's where things get complicated. According to internal reports later obtained by investigators, the paperwork for another inmate, a man with a similar first name, had been mistakenly swapped with Kebatu's. By the time anyone realized, he was already gone. At 11:45 a.m., he was handed his personal belongings, a wallet, a phone, and a small plastic bag with clothes. He signed the release sheet, walked through the gate, and disappeared into the streets of Essex. He was a free man. But he wasn't supposed to be. At 12:57 p.m., Essex police received a call from the prison service. Error in inmate release. Possible risk to the public. Individuals identified as Kebatu, Hadush, released in error. In other words, they'd let a convicted child predator back into the community. And now, no one knew where he was. The official call came in at 12:57 p.m. local time. It was short, urgent, almost unbelievable. We've released the wrong inmate. The officer on duty reportedly froze. Prison staff began scrambling through files. Names didn't match. IDs were duplicated. And in a sea of paper and bureaucracy, one line stood out, bold and horrifying. Inmate 57219, released. Hadush Kebatu. They immediately called Essex Police. Within minutes, alerts were sent to the National Crime Agency, the Metropolitan Police, and Border Force. Every unit in southeast England was told to be on high alert. Subject male, Ethiopian national, 32, approximately 5'9", dark jacket, gray trousers. Do not approach. Convicted of sexual assault. Believed dangerous. Now, let's pause for a second. Because here's where the error stops sounding like a mistake and starts looking like a catastrophic system failure. At Chelmsford Prison that morning, staff were processing multiple releases, part of routine schedule management. Due to chronic understaffing, one officer had been assigned to verify 9 files at once. 9. Some of those files had handwritten notes. Others were digital printouts from an outdated prison management system. And according to early reports, a clerical typo, a mis-entered inmate number, led to Kebatu's name being flagged for release. One click. One signature. And a convicted child predator walked free. When investigators later questioned staff, one officer said quietly, "We didn't even realize until his probation officer called." By then, he was already gone. The manhunt began at 1:30 p.m. sharp. The first order came from Essex Police Chief Constable B.J. Harrington. Priority 1, locate, identify, and detain the suspect. Use all available resources. But there was a problem. Hadush Kebatu had no fixed address, no registered bank account, no phone number on record that was active. He was, for all practical purposes, a ghost. And yet, he had one advantage the authorities hadn't considered. He knew how to disappear. At 2:14 p.m., a witness near the Chelmsford bus station reported a man matching Kebatu's description boarding a coach to London Victoria. CCTV later confirmed it. He had used cash to buy a ticket, likely from money stored with his belongings. The footage showed him sitting in the back row, hood pulled over his head, staring straight ahead. For the next hour and a half, he rode quietly into the capital, while police scrambled 50 miles behind him. By 4 p.m., he was gone again. The next sighting came around 5:30 p.m. A shopkeeper in North London reported a man acting nervous and disoriented, trying to buy a cheap mobile phone at a corner store. The man had an accent. Didn't seem to know where he was. Police rushed to the area, but by the time they arrived, he had slipped through the side streets toward Finsbury Park. Now, if you know Finsbury Park, you'll know it's a crowded part of London. Dense, multicultural, full of transient housing. It's the kind of place where someone like Kebatu could blend in. And that's exactly what he did. By Friday evening, news outlets had caught wind of the story. BBC, Sky News, Daily Mail, all pushing breaking headlines. Convicted sex offender released in error, manhunt underway. Twitter, or X, as it's now called, exploded. Hashtag Chelmsford Prison trended within hours. People were furious and frightened. How does something like this even happen? What if he hurts someone else? By midnight, protesters began gathering again outside the Bell Hotel in Epping, the same hotel where Kebatu had assaulted the 14-year-old girl just months earlier. Some came with signs. Others came with anger. The demonstrations turned violent. By 1 a.m. police cars were vandalized. Windows smashed. Hotel staff had to be evacuated under police escort. All because of one mistake. The next morning, the headlines were even darker. Government error frees predator. Manhunt sparks riots. Where is Hadush Kebatu? Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy announced an urgent investigation into the release, calling it unacceptable and deeply concerning. And by dawn, Prime Minister Keir Starmer addressed the nation. This was a serious failure. It will be corrected. And once apprehended, Mr. Kebatu will be deported from the United Kingdom. But as he spoke, the police still didn't know where Kebatu was. And every minute that passed felt heavier, like a ticking bomb. It's now Saturday morning. Kebatu has been missing for over 24 hours. Detectives trace his path through CCTV, bus stations, street corners, cash points. One clip shows him walking under a railway bridge near Holloway Road, his hood up, carrying a small plastic bag. Another camera, an hour later, catches him ducking into a public toilet near Finsbury Park Station. Then nothing. He vanishes for the night. What no one knew at the time was that Kebatu had been sleeping rough, hiding in a small park shelter near the railway tracks. He was cold. He was hungry. And he knew the police were closing in. Just before 7 a.m. Sunday, a passerby spotted a man matching his description walking toward a cafe on Seven Sisters Road. The man looked tired, unshaven. He ordered coffee, sat by the window. Moments later, a pair of plainclothes officers entered quietly. They waited, watched. Then one of them approached. Hadush Kebatu? He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just looked up and said, "You found me." At 8:30 a.m., officers from the Metropolitan Police arrested Hadush Kebatu in the Finsbury Park area of London. It was over. The manhunt, fast-moving, chaotic, and public, had finally come to an end. By Sunday afternoon, the headlines read, "Fugitive caught, deportation pending." Prime Minister Keir Starmer released a firm statement. He will be deported. And we will make sure this never happens again. But those words, never again, rang hollow for many. Because this wasn't the first time. From wrongful releases to system failures to human error, Britain's justice system had been showing cracks for years. And now, under the spotlight, every flaw was visible. Essex police called the manhunt fast-moving and complex. But the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted answers. Behind closed doors, the prison service quietly launched an internal investigation. Early findings pointed to a data input error during a manual release verification process. Translation. Someone typed the wrong number. But the consequences were national. A 14-year-old's trauma was reignited. Communities were divided. And once again, Britain's asylum policy was thrust into the spotlight, not for compassion, but for chaos. In the final part, we dive into the fallout, how this case changed government policy, divided the public, and exposed the uncomfortable truth about immigration and justice in Britain. And we'll ask the question no one wants to answer. Was this really a mistake? Or a symptom of something much deeper? At 8:30 a.m. Sunday, police arrested Hadush Kebatu in London's Finsbury Park. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even speak, except to whisper one phrase. I thought I was free. He was taken to a secure police station for processing. By the afternoon, the Home Office confirmed that deportation proceedings were being prepared immediately. It was fast, almost too fast. Normally, deportation takes months, sometimes years. But this case wasn't about process anymore, it was about politics. Outside Parliament, Prime Minister Keir Starmer faced cameras. This was an inexcusable failure, he said. It cannot, and will not, be repeated. He promised new oversight protocols, better coordination between the prison service and Home Office, and, most controversially, a review of how asylum seekers are housed and monitored in the UK. It wasn't just a statement. It was damage control. Because while Kebatu sat in custody, his case had become a symbol of failure, of fear, of everything the public thought was wrong with Britain's handling of immigration and justice. By Monday, protests had spread across 9 cities: London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds. The far right seized the narrative. Online influencers, political agitators, and fringe media outlets painted the case as proof that asylum seekers were dangerous, and that Britain's compassion had gone too far. At the Bell Hotel, the same hotel where it all began, riot police were forced to hold back mobs. A handful of arrests, broken windows, tear gas in the air. One officer was overheard saying, "All this because of one file." But of course, it wasn't just one file. This was bigger. This was about trust. In the weeks that followed, the British public began to lose faith, not just in the asylum system, but in the institutions that were meant to protect them. Talk radio hosts railed against government incompetence. Editorials called it the Chelmsford crisis. And social media, always hungry for outrage, turned the story into a firestorm. Every headline had the same words: mistaken release, sex offender, asylum seeker. The nuance was gone. The truth was lost in the noise. Behind the scenes, an independent inquiry began quietly. Led by senior officials from the Ministry of Justice, the report was supposed to explain how a man convicted of assaulting a minor could simply walk free. What they found was devastating. The official summary, released 6 weeks later, revealed a chain of failures. Outdated digital records, misfiled paperwork, understaffed verification teams, inadequate data sharing between the prison service and probation office, and, most damning of all, no secondary review for early release authorizations. One person, one signature. That was all it took. The report described the system as vulnerable to clerical error and lacking adequate safeguards to prevent unlawful release. It also noted that Chelmsford Prison had been flagged for record management risks as far back as 2023. In other words, the warning signs were there. They were just ignored. When the report reached Parliament, the reaction was swift, but divided. Some MPs demanded the resignation of the Justice Secretary. Others accused opposition parties of exploiting the tragedy for politics. But the real question, the one no one seemed able to answer, was simple. If this can happen once, who's next? And that question didn't go away. You see, Britain's asylum and justice systems were already on shaky ground. Overcrowded prisons, underpaid officers, backlogged courts, and temporary asylum housing stretched to its limits. The Bell Hotel in Epping was one of hundreds across the country quietly converted into migrant accommodation. It was meant to be temporary, a stopgap solution. But over time, it became something else, a flashpoint. Locals felt ignored. Asylum seekers felt trapped. And when a crime occurred, those tensions exploded. The government had tried to hold the line, balancing compassion with control. But the Kebatu case shattered that illusion. For many, it confirmed their worst fears, that the system had lost control. For others, it became a weapon, a way to justify anger and prejudice. And that's the tragedy of it all. Because while politicians debated policy, and while protesters shouted in the streets, a 14-year-old girl in Epping was forced to relive her trauma. seeing her attacker's face on every screen, every headline, every social feed. The people at the center of these stories rarely get to move on. They become symbols, sound bites, political tools. But behind every scandal, there's still a victim. And that's something we too often forget. When I look back on the case of Hadush Kebatu, I don't just see a criminal. I see a mirror. A mirror held up to Britain, to its compassion, its chaos, and its contradictions. This wasn't just a story about one man escaping justice. It was a story about what happens when systems fail, when politics overrides prevention, and when humanity becomes secondary to headlines. Because the truth is, mistakes happen. But not all mistakes carry the same weight. Some can be fixed. Others leave scars. And this one left scars on a nation. In the months that followed, the government passed new legislation tightening early release checks. Digital systems were upgraded. Procedures rewritten. But the damage was already done. Kebatu was deported in early December, escorted by officers on a private charter flight to Addis Ababa. His story ended quietly. No more headlines. No more protests. But Britain didn't forget. In every society, justice is built on trust. We trust the courts to punish. We trust the prisons to contain. We trust the system to protect. But when that trust breaks, even once, it takes generations to rebuild. The case of Hadush Kebatu wasn't just about a man who walked free. It was about a country forced to confront its failures, its fears, and its fragile balance between mercy and accountability. And maybe that's the real crime. Because in the end, what happened at Chelmsford Prison wasn't just a mistake. It was a warning.